There is a woman from the American South who climbed to the very top of New York society. And then, when she had everything she'd fought for, deliberately destroyed it. She crashed the gates of the most exclusive social circle in America. She built palaces and threw parties that left the entire city breathless. She arranged a wedding so grand it made front pages across 2 continents. And then she walked away from all of it and spent the second half of her life trying to tear down the very world she had built. Her name was Alva Vanderbilt, and almost nothing about her life went the way anyone expected. A southern girl with expensive taste and no money to back it up. Alva Erskine Smith came into the world on January 17th, 1853, in Mobile, Alabama, into a family that had both social standing and the constant anxiety of not having enough money to sustain it. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, was a cotton merchant, a man of reasonable prospects in the antebellum South, with a large enough house and enough connections to position his family comfortably in Mobile's society. Her mother, Phoebe Desher Smith, came from political stock. Her grandfather, Robert Desher, had served in the United States Congress, and the family name carried weight. Alva was the middle child among 5 surviving children, and from the beginning she was considered the difficult one. Too sharp, too stubborn, too determined to have her way. The word people used, half affectionately and half despairingly, was impossible. She once recalled a childhood moment that never left her. When she was 4 years old, a brother died, and family friends arrived to offer condolences to her parents. The remarks she overheard, that a son's death was a tragedy in a way a daughter's never quite would be, settled into her with a permanence that shaped everything that came after. It was her first lesson in what the world thought women were worth, and she spent the rest of her life arguing with it. When the Civil War came, it unraveled whatever financial security the Smiths had built. Murray Smith moved his family first to New York City around 1859, briefly settling near Madison Square. Then, when Murray left for England to pursue his business, Alva's mother took the children to Paris, where Alva was enrolled in a private boarding school in Neuilly-sur-Seine. Those years in Paris lasted through much of the 1860s, and they were formative in a way that would echo through every mansion she ever built and every party she ever threw. Paris was not just a city. It was an education in aesthetics and aspiration. Alva moved through a world of chateaux and formal gardens, of carved stone and gilded interiors, of rooms where proportions and furnishings were treated as serious art. She developed a sophisticated eye for architecture, for furniture, for fashion, and for the way spaces could produce specific effects on the people who entered them. She was absorbing the visual vocabulary of European aristocracy the way other children absorbed their mother tongue, and she was doing it at an age when such impressions sink deepest. She also developed something else in those years: the company of girls from French and European families who would go on to marry titles, who spoke casually about dukes and estates the way American girls might speak about parties in Manhattan. Through her closest friend, Consuelo Isnaga, who would later become the Viscountess Mandeville, Alva had a window into a world that mixed American money with European hereditary rank, and she studied what she saw with characteristic precision. But the money continued to run out. When the Smith family returned to New York after the war, the situation was worse than it had been before it began. Alva's mother died in 1871, when Alva was 17, and the family's finances went with her. By the time Alva was approaching her early 20s, she was a well-educated young woman with expensive tastes, a formidable will, deep social connections through Consuelo Isnaga, and almost nothing in her pocket. The solution, in the world she occupied, was marriage. The question was to whom? The Vanderbilt name, and what she did with it. The introduction came through Consuelo Iznaga, Alva's best friend since childhood, a half-American, half-Cuban young woman of considerable charm who moved through social circles with an ease that even Alva admired. At a party for one of William Henry Vanderbilt's daughters in the early 1870s, Consuelo introduced Alva to William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the self-made railroad and shipping magnate who had died one of the richest men in American history, with an estate worth over $100 million. William Kissam, known as Willie K, was charming in a casual, unserious sort of way. He liked yachts and horses, and did not think especially hard about much else. What he had, in almost incomprehensible abundance, was money. Alva had almost none. What Alva had instead was ambition that would have frightened a lesser man into running, but Willie K, who was not particularly ambitious himself, seemed to find it appealing. They married on April 20th, 1875, at Calvary Church in New York City. Alva was 22 years old. She stepped into the Vanderbilt name with the precision of someone who had been waiting years for exactly this opportunity, and she began, almost immediately, to do what she had always been doing in her head: build. The Vanderbilts, for all their extraordinary wealth, were not accepted by New York's ruling social class. The problem was the patriarch, Cornelius, the old Commodore himself, dead since 1877. He had made his fortune in steamships and railroads, accumulated it with ruthless efficiency, and spent relatively little time worrying about what polite society thought of him. He was rough-edged and blunt, and not remotely interested in performing the social graces expected of the elite. He had been, in the language of the era, too crass. A man who had gotten very rich very fast, rather than having been born into wealth long enough for it to acquire respectability. The arbiters of New York society, led by a woman named Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as the Mrs. Astor, had decided that the Vanderbilts were not among the 400. That was the informal name for the roughly 400 people considered acceptable members of New York's highest social tier, a number said to have been derived from the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom. Her social secretary, a man named Ward McAllister, who cultivated the role of arbiter with visible pleasure, maintained the list and made clear to anyone who asked that new money, no matter how much of it there was, did not automatically qualify for inclusion. Alva found this situation intolerable. She was married to one of the richest families in America, and some old money woman with a ballroom was going to determine whether she was acceptable. She set about changing this with the focus of someone who had been underestimated their entire life and had decided to make everyone who had done so regret it. Her first move was architectural. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the most fashionable architect in the country, to build her a mansion at 665th Avenue in Manhattan, a French Renaissance chateau-style residence on the northwest corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. It was nicknamed the Petit Chateau, though there was nothing small about it. Construction ran from 1878 to 1882. When it was done, Alva didn't just move in. She planned a party, the ball that cracked society open. On the evening of March 26, 1883, the carriages began arriving at 665th Avenue at 10 o'clock. Nearly 1,200 guests came, or tried to come. The entire block was surrounded by crowds held back by police who had been deployed specifically for the occasion. New York had not seen anything like it. In the weeks leading up to the evening, Alva had done something unprecedented. She invited journalists to come into the mansion beforehand and preview the decorations, feeding the city's newspapers enough detail to keep New York talking about nothing else for weeks. Invitations had been dispatched by uniformed servants. Guests had spent weeks practicing the assigned quadrilles, elaborate group dances that required coordination and rehearsal, and that were, in their own way, a test of who was prepared enough to deserve an invitation. The dressmakers of New York and Paris had been working at capacity for months. The estimated cost to the guests in costumes alone ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The entire event cost the couple approximately $250,000, a figure that translates to something in the range of $7 million today. This included $65,000 for champagne alone and $11,000 for flowers. But Alva's most precise move in the whole affair was something far simpler than the flower arrangements or the catering. She had deliberately omitted Mrs. Astor from the guest list, on the perfectly etiquette-correct grounds that since Mrs. Astor had never formally called on Alva at the Petit Chateau, she had no proper address to send an invitation to. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, who was of marriageable age and deeply invested in the social calendar, had been practicing her quadrille with friends who had all received their invitations. The family waited. Nothing arrived. Mrs. Astor relented. She sent her formal calling card to the Vanderbilt residence on Fifth Avenue. The invitation followed the next day. Mrs. Astor and her daughter attended the ball. And by the simple act of showing up, the most powerful social gatekeeper in New York had officially, publicly, acknowledged the Vanderbilts. Inside the mansion that night, guests moved through rooms transformed into landscapes of spectacle. A third-floor gymnasium had been converted into an indoor forest, with real palm trees and orchids and bougainvillea. Dinner was served at 2 a.m. by the chefs of Delmonico's. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian princess, in a gown of white and yellow brocade with a blue satin train and embroidery in gold. Her sister-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, wore a dress representing the electric light, a hand-held battery-powered torch that actually lit up, created by the couturier Charles Frederick Worth. Dancing continued until the sun came up. Men in powdered wigs were seen stumbling down Fifth Avenue as children made their way to school, which was, in its own way, a perfect summary of the evening. Alva had won. The Vanderbilts were in the 400. Now she needed somewhere to put them. Marble House and the architecture of ambition. If the Petit Chateau had been a declaration of intent, what Alva built next was a statement of dominance. Newport, Rhode Island, was where Gilded Age New York went in the summer, a stretch of coastline on Bellevue Avenue where the wealthy had built their so-called cottages, which were in fact enormous houses designed to outshine one another in as many ways as money could devise. The Astors had a home there. Beechwood, a rambling structure directly next to the lot Alva had her eye on. So did everyone who mattered. Alva decided the Vanderbilts would have the finest of all. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt again, this time for a summer residence modelled on the Petit Trianon at Versailles, the intimate palace built for Marie Antoinette within the grounds of the larger complex. The result, built between 1888 and 1892, was Marble House, a neoclassical structure with a facade of white Westchester marble quarried from New York, with interiors sheathed in rare marbles and gilded bronze in shades of gold, pink, and deep crimson. The gold ballroom alone, whose walls were covered in gilded bronze relief work, was considered one of the most extraordinary private interiors in America at the time of its completion. Hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of marble were used in its construction. The cost, by the time furnishings were included, was approximately $9 million. Marble House was presented as a birthday gift to Alva from William in 1892, on the occasion of his 39th birthday, a gesture that was itself a kind of theatre. The house was given to her outright, meaning it was legally hers in a way that most women's property was not, at a time when married women's property rights were still heavily constrained. Alva understood property law well enough to know the difference, and she had insisted on the arrangement. She moved into Marble House with the satisfaction of someone who had precisely realized a vision that had been forming since she first walked through French chateaux as a girl. She hired Hunt's firm to add finishing elements, oversaw every detail of the landscaping, and made Newport's social calendar rotate around her summers in a way that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier when the Vanderbilt name couldn't get through Mrs. Astor's door. But William understood almost nothing of what Alva was actually doing, and almost nothing of what was happening inside their marriage. He was a man of genuine charm and essentially no depth, and the years had revealed him to be reliably unfaithful. The details circulated in New York drawing rooms. His affairs were not conducted with particular discretion, and Alva endured it for as long as she was willing to, and then she stopped enduring it. What she did next was so unexpected that it is difficult, even now, to fully appreciate how extraordinary it was. The divorce that changed everything, and cost her almost as much as it gained. In March 1895, Alva Vanderbilt announced that she was divorcing William Kissam Vanderbilt on the grounds of his adultery. She was 42 years old, one of the most socially prominent women in America, and she was walking away from a marriage at a time when divorce among the elite was essentially unheard of. The whispers had been circulating for years. William's infidelities were an open secret, but nobody had expected Alva to do anything about it. Women in her position endured. That was simply what was done. Alva did not endure. She hired lawyers and initiated proceedings that shocked society far more than William's behavior had. The financial settlement she received was reported at more than $10 million, an extraordinary sum that reflected both the scale of the Vanderbilt fortune and the legal leverage Alva had secured. She retained Marble House outright, which she had already owned. She received several additional estates and a settlement that gave her genuine financial independence for the rest of her life. William moved to France, where he built a chateau and established a horse racing farm near Deauville. He remarried in 1903. What Alva had not calculated, or perhaps had calculated and accepted, was the social cost. The backlash was swift and severe. The very world she had spent 20 years building, the dinners, the invitations, the social architecture of the 400, collapsed around her. Women who had eaten at her table stopped calling. Invitations dried up. The Astors, whose recognition she had worked so hard to obtain, were among those who turned cold. Society, it turned out, would tolerate almost anything except a woman who left. But Alva was not a woman who retreated. She had, in the months before the divorce was finalized, been working on something else entirely. She had decided that her daughter Consuelo would become a duchess. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 years old in 1895, beautiful, gentle, and deeply in love with a young American man named Winthrop Rutherford, a member of old New York society, a perfectly respectable match by almost any standard. Alva did not find him acceptable. She had been watching the phenomenon of wealthy American girls marrying into impoverished European aristocracies, trading dollars for titles, and had decided this was the path her daughter would take. The match she had in mind was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a cousin of the future Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The Duke had inherited the monumental Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, along with debts that were threatening to consume it. He needed an American fortune. Alva had one available. The arrangement, as she saw it, was symmetrical. Consuelo did not see it that way. She was secretly engaged to Rutherford and intended to elope with him. When Alva discovered this, the response was swift. According to Consuelo's own later account, she was locked in her room. Threats were made, including, reportedly, that Rutherford himself would be harmed if Consuelo did not comply. Consuelo still refused. Then Alva claimed to be gravely ill, that her health was being destroyed by her daughter's defiance, and that she might not survive the strain of it. Consuelo gave in. Alva appeared to make a rapid recovery. The Duke came to America in the summer of 1895. He and Consuelo were formally engaged in September. Alva leaked the news to the press immediately and fed journalists a steady stream of details about the wedding preparations, including, reportedly, the gold fastenings on Consuelo's undergarments. The spectacle was managed with the same professional precision Alva had applied to every other social undertaking of her life. The wedding took place at St. Thomas's Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan on November 6, 1895. Crowds so large they required police management gathered outside. Those who could see the bride as she entered the church noted that she appeared to have been weeping. The Duke, for his part, had reportedly left behind a woman he loved in England to enter a marriage he needed for financial reasons. Both participants in the arrangement, in other words, had been steered into it by forces outside themselves. The financial settlement negotiated by the Vanderbilt family was substantial. $2.5 million placed in trust, plus a guaranteed annual income of $100,000. The Duke would use a significant portion of this to restore Blenheim Palace. Consuelo would live in England as a duchess, admired by the public and the press, and deeply unhappy for most of the years she spent in the marriage. Alva had her duchess. And just a few weeks later, on January 11th, 1896, she had a new husband of her own, Oliver Belmont, and the life that surprised her. Oliver Hazard, Perry Belmont, had been a friend of the Vanderbilt family since the late 1880s. He had accompanied William and Alva on voyages aboard their yacht, the Alva, a 285-foot vessel that had been the largest privately owned yacht in the world at the time of its construction, larger even than J.P. Morgan's famous Corsair, and larger than Mrs. Astor's Nourmahal. He was the son of August Belmont, who represented the European banking interests of the Rothschild family in America, and whose family name was attached to the Belmont Park racetrack on Long Island. He was, in short, from the right world. They married on January 11th, 1896, in a civil ceremony conducted by the mayor of New York. Alva moved into Oliver's 60-room Newport mansion, Belcourt, and immediately began renovating it. She could not seem to exist in a space without reshaping it. The entire ground floor of Belcourt had been designed as carriage space and stables for Oliver's prize horses, a situation Alva found absurd and quickly addressed. She transformed the interiors into a blend of French and English Gothic and Renaissance styles, installing medieval armor collections and stained glass alongside the kinds of French furnishings she had spent her life acquiring. It was characteristically eclectic and characteristically magnificent. Oliver, unlike William, appears to have been genuinely compatible with Alva in temperament, or at least willing to let her operate at full capacity, which for Alva may have amounted to the same thing. The marriage was quieter than her first, more private, without the social climbing urgency that had driven the Vanderbilt years. She had already climbed. Now she was simply living. They spent time between Newport and their New York townhouse and traveled. Alva was involved in the early stages of the Metropolitan Opera. She had been among its founders in 1883, alongside other prominent families who wanted an opera house more suited to new money than the old Academy of Music, which old money New York had controlled. She continued to oversee properties, to entertain, to exist at the center of whatever social world she was in. The marriage was happier than Alva's first, though it lasted a much shorter time. Oliver died in June 1908, following complications from an appendectomy. He was 50 years old. Alva was 55, wealthy, widowed, and for the first time in her adult life, with no social campaign to run, no mansion to commission, no marriage to arrange. She had spent 30 years playing by the rules of a world that had been built entirely for the benefit of men and the social ambitions of women who served those men's interests. And somewhere in the space left by Oliver's death, something shifted. The woman who had fought her way to the top of the Gilded Age social order was about to start fighting against it instead. The suffragist who built a movement with her fortune. The story of how Alva Belmont, as she was now known, became one of the most consequential figures in the American women's suffrage movement is, in a way, the most surprising chapter of a life full of surprises. It began in 1909, when Alva attended lectures by the suffragist Ida Husted Harper, and then began showing up at meetings of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, known as NAWSA. She was not exactly welcomed with open arms. She was rich, imperious, and accustomed to running things her own way. And the NAWSA leadership was a cautious, methodical organization that had been working at the state level for decades. The first time Alva attended a meeting, she was struck by how conservative and slow-moving the organization was, and she said so. What she brought to the movement that it hadn't had before was money on an extraordinary scale, a network of influential contacts that stretched from Newport to Washington to London, and a tactical aggression born of decades of fighting battles in rooms full of powerful people who didn't think she belonged there. That same year, New York City was gripped by a massive labor action, the Shirtwaist Workers' Strike of 1909 and 1910, in which tens of thousands of mostly young, mostly immigrant women, garment workers, walked off their jobs in protest of dangerous conditions and wages that barely sustained survival. The strike was met with police arrests of picketers. Most of polite society looked away. Alva did not. She raised strike funds, helped organize rallies, and showed up at court hearings in support of women who had been arrested for picketing. A woman of extraordinary personal wealth, standing alongside textile workers from the Lower East Side, making a point through her physical presence that money couldn't muffle. She was criticized for it from every direction. Labor organizers suspected her motives. Conservative suffragists worried about being associated with working-class militancy. Alva took the criticism and kept going. She founded the Political Equality Association in 1909, wrote newspaper columns in favor of the vote, and threw open the doors of Marble House, the palace she had built on the Newport shore, for suffrage meetings and conferences. In the summer of 1914, she convened what she called a Conference of Great Women at Marble House, which served as the first national meeting of the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. She had found, in the British suffragette leader Emmeline Pankhurst, someone whose approach matched her own temperament. The English militants were not asking politely for the vote. They were disrupting and marching and forcing their way into the conversation, and Alva thought they had the right idea. She was among the first American suffrage leaders to publicly endorse the tactics of the British militants. And when Pankhurst travelled to America in 1913 and was detained at Ellis Island by officials nervous about her reputation for confrontational tactics, Alva hired lawyers and applied pressure until Pankhurst was released after 2.5 days. In 1916, she and Alice Paul co-founded the National Woman's Party. In January 1917, Alva helped organize the first ever picket line in front of the White House, women standing in silent protest outside the home of the President of the United States, holding banners day after day. in a demonstration that was unprecedented and controversial in equal measure. When picketers were arrested and sent to Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia, where conditions were brutal, Alva chaired a mass meeting at the Belasco Theatre in December 1917 for thousands of attendees to honor the released prisoners. She donated enormous sums to the movement at every stage. When the Congressional Union needed a headquarters in Washington, she provided the money. When the NWP purchased the old brick Capitol building near the Supreme Court and later had to vacate it, she bought the organization a new building on Constitution Avenue. She pledged what was reported as $500,000 to the National Woman's Party at its founding convention in 1916. Described at the time as the largest single political campaign pledge ever made. The 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was ratified in August 1920. Alva was 67 years old, and she was not finished. The moment she told the truth about Consuelo. In the years following the ratification, Alva's relationship with her daughter Consuelo had changed considerably. The marriage to the Duke of Marlborough had been, from the beginning, as loveless as one might expect, of two people forced into it by financial and social calculation. Consuelo had adapted. She had become a popular duchess, praised by the British press, respected by the aristocracy, genuinely committed to philanthropic and reform causes. But the private reality was bleak. The couple had separated officially in 1906, after years of living largely apart, and divorced in 1921. The Duke then sought to have the marriage annulled by the Vatican, which required demonstrating that the union had not been freely entered into, a standard that, given the circumstances of the wedding, he had little difficulty meeting. In 1926, Alva testified in the annulment proceedings. She stated, with the directness she had always possessed, that she had forced her daughter to marry the Duke. She acknowledged that she had exercised complete control over Consuelo and had used that control to secure a marriage Consuelo did not want. The exact language she used, that she had always had absolute power over her daughter and had exercised it, was blunt even by Alva's standards. It was a remarkable admission, not just legally, but personally. Alva was one of the few powerful women of her era who, when confronted with the harm she had caused, said clearly and on the record that she had done it. There was no deflection, no softening, no attribution of blame to circumstances or convention. She had done it. She said so. The annulment was granted. Consuelo was free and went on to spend the rest of her long life happily married to Jacques Balsan, the French aviator she had first known in her debutante years. She and Alva, in their later years, enjoyed a closer relationship than they had during the long and difficult years of the arranged marriage. The kind of relationship that sometimes only becomes possible after the worst has been said and acknowledged and survived. Whether Alva felt genuine remorse for what she had done to her daughter, or whether her testimony was primarily a practical act designed to facilitate the annulment, is something she left ambiguous. What is clear is that by the time she made that statement, she had spent nearly 2 decades fighting for the legal rights of women, which made her role in her daughter's story something she could not pretend had never happened. Paris, and the long final chapter. By the early 1920s, Alva had moved to Paris, where she settled into a world increasingly focused on international women's rights. The American battle had been won, partially. The 19th Amendment gave women the vote, but Alva was acutely aware that the vote was not the end of the story. Women still faced legal inequality in property, in employment, in marriage law, and in citizenship. A married American woman could lose her citizenship if she married a foreign national. Alva thought this was absurd, and she said so at length in print. She had never stopped building. She oversaw the construction or renovation of several more properties during her life, including Beacon Towers at Sands Point on Long Island, a Gothic revival castle she had built around 1918. She sold Beacon Towers in 1927 to William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate, who added to it extensively before it was eventually demolished in 1945. In Paris, she worked with Alice Paul and others on international frameworks for women's equality, treaties and agreements that would extend legal protections beyond the United States. In 1926, she helped establish what would become the International Advisory Committee of the National Woman's Party, pushing for a cross-border approach to women's rights at a time when most Americans considered the domestic battle already won with the 19th Amendment and were moving on. She attended international conferences, wrote, organized, and spent her fortune with the same lack of restraint she had always brought to the things she believed in. She remained formidable into old age. The story has been told, by the private secretary of Winston Churchill, that Alva was one of only a handful of people she had ever seen genuinely intimidate the future Prime Minister. That when Alva decided to make a point in conversation, Churchill found himself outmaneuvered and knew it. She suffered a debilitating stroke in 1932 and died on January 26, 1933, in Paris, 9 days after her 80th birthday. She had asked, with characteristic precision, that her funeral be managed entirely by women. The pallbearers at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York City, the same church where she had steered Consuelo down the aisle 38 years earlier, were all women. Approximately 1,500 people attended. Her coffin was draped with one of the picket banners from the White House demonstrations, bearing the phrase, "Failure is impossible." She was buried beside Oliver Belmont at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. She left $100,000 to the National Woman's Party in her will. What she left standing. The physical monuments to Alva Vanderbilt Belmont still exist, and several of them are remarkable. Marble House in Newport is now a museum property owned by the Preservation Society of Newport County. It is open to the public, and visitors walk through the gold ballroom, sheathed in gilded bronze and pink Numidian marble, and through the rooms that Alva designed to outbuild every other structure on Bellevue Avenue. The Chinese tea house she added to the back of the property in 1914, where she held suffrage meetings, still stands on the edge of the cliff walk overlooking the Atlantic. The incongruity of it, a ornate pagoda-style structure perched above the ocean, used for feminist organizing, is somehow entirely appropriate for a woman whose life defied straightforward categorization at every turn. The Petit Chateau on Fifth Avenue was sold in 1926 and demolished in 1927, a casualty of the same commercial transformation of Manhattan that consumed many of the great houses of the Gilded Age. The site became a commercial building. Then, eventually, the Rockefeller Center complex arrived nearby and changed the character of that stretch of Fifth Avenue entirely. The block Alva had filled with her first great statement of ambition is now retail and office space. The building she purchased in Washington for the National Woman's Party was eventually designated the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument by President Barack Obama on April 12, 2016, Equal Pay Day, named for both Alva Belmont and Alice Paul in recognition of their roles in winning the vote. Her daughter, Consuelo, lived a long and largely happy life, dying in 1964 at the age of 87. She wrote a memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, in which she described her childhood and forced marriage with a candor that was unusual for the era. It remains one of the more honest accounts of what it meant to be a Gilded Age heiress, the beauty and the captivity of it, the way wealth could be both a cage and a stage. Her second marriage to Jacques Balsan, the French aviator, lasted until Balson's death in 1956. She spent her final years in Palm Beach and Southampton and was, by all accounts, at peace. The world Alva fought so hard to join, the 400, the Newport summer colony, the elaborate social hierarchy she had cracked open with a single party in 1883, did not survive much past her own lifetime. The Gilded Age ended, the fortunes were divided and taxed and scattered, the mansions were sold or demolished or converted to other uses. Several of the great Newport cottages are now museums, preserved as historical artifacts of an era that lasted about 40 years before the income tax, the First World War, and the Depression dismantled the economic conditions that had produced them. Alva had understood something, somewhere along the way, that most of the people around her did not. The rules that governed who belonged and who didn't, who was acceptable and who was not, were not natural laws. They were arrangements made by people to serve the interests of some people at the expense of others. She had proved that they could be broken by someone determined enough. And then she had spent the second half of her life trying to break the larger set of rules that governed what women could do, own, and decide for themselves. She was difficult, domineering, sometimes cruel, and often wrong about the most personal decisions of all. She was also one of the most consequential women of her century, and she built the platform that made her consequential entirely on her own terms. That combination, the damage and the achievement, existing together without cancelling each other out, is what makes her impossible to simplify and impossible to dismiss. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There is a woman whose name became shorthand for scandal, blamed for shaking an empire, humiliating a king, and destroying a monarchy's most sacred tradition. For decades, newspapers called her a villain. The British royal family called her simply unacceptable. But here is the part that almost never gets told. She never asked for any of it. Wallis Simpson was born into a world that gave her very little and demanded from her everything. What actually happened to her, from her early years in Baltimore to her final isolated days in Paris, is far more complicated, far more painful, and far more human than the legend ever let on. Baltimore beginnings. A girl without a father. Wallis Simpson was born on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, while her parents were vacationing there. But Baltimore, Maryland, was her real home. That's where she grew up, where she was shaped, and where the early losses that would define her character first took root. Her full name at birth was Bessie Wallace Warfield. She would eventually drop the Bessie entirely, too plain, too ordinary. But the Warfield name carried weight in Baltimore society. Her father, Teakle Wallace Warfield, came from a well-established Maryland family. Her mother, Alice Montague, was a Southern belle with charm to spare and very little money of her own. The problem was, the Warfield wealth didn't flow naturally to Wallace's branch of the family. Her father, Teakle, was ill almost from the beginning of her life, tuberculosis most likely, and he died when Wallace was just 5 months old. She never knew him, not a single real memory, not one held conversation. Just a name, a portrait, and a ghost that followed her through childhood. That left Alice a young widow with an infant daughter, no real income, and a social position that depended almost entirely on the goodwill of relatives. For the next several years, they lived largely at the mercy of Wallace's paternal uncle, Solomon Davies Warfield, a prominent Baltimore banker and businessman. Uncle Sol, as he was known, helped support them financially, but he was a severe, distant man, generous in the transactional sense, cold in every other way. Alice eventually remarried in 1908 to a man named John Freeman Racine, who came from a politically connected Baltimore family. He was warm and kind, a welcome change from the austerity of Uncle Sol's orbit. But he too died young, in 1913, leaving Alice a widow once more, and leaving Wallace, now a teenager, with a familiar lesson quietly reinforcing itself. The men in her life didn't stay. What Wallace did have, even as a child, was a sharpness that other people noticed. She was not conventionally beautiful. She knew that too, and would acknowledge it openly as an adult. She was angular, with a strong jaw and wide-set blue eyes. But she had presence. She had wit. She had the kind of conversational energy that made people lean in. A schoolmate from her years at Arundel School in Baltimore later recalled that Wallace had an ability to hold a room simply by talking, not loudly, but precisely, with a dry humour that didn't feel like performance. She attended the Oldfield School, a prestigious boarding school in Maryland, on a partial scholarship arranged through her uncle. It was there that she received a proper upper-class education and mixed with girls from families far wealthier than her own. She learned how to carry herself in those rooms, how to be interesting without revealing too much, and how to make people feel like the most important person she was talking to, skills she would rely on for the rest of her life. When she graduated in 1914, the world was on the edge of war, and Wallace was on the edge of adulthood. Well-mannered, ambitious, and quietly desperate for a life that felt stable. She would look for that stability in marriage. Twice, she would not find it. And the third time, the cost would be a crown. What happened in her first marriage, and why it left marks that never fully healed, is where the story gets darker. The first marriage. Wynne Spencer, and the years she rarely spoke about. In the spring of 1916, Wallace met Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. at a social gathering in Pensacola, Florida, where she had gone to visit a cousin. Spencer was a U.S. Navy aviator, dashing, confident, the kind of man who wore his uniform like a statement. He was 27, she was 19. By November of that same year, they were married at Christ Episcopal Church in Baltimore. It was swift, as courtships in that era often were, especially with a war grinding through Europe and young men who felt the urgency of everything. Wallace later wrote in her memoirs that Wynne Spencer was the most exciting man she had ever met at that point in her life. The excitement did not last. Spencer's drinking had been present from early in the marriage, but it deepened as the years went on, shifting from a social habit into something that warped his behavior entirely. His moods became unpredictable, sometimes charming, sometimes cruel. He grew jealous and controlling. There were incidents Wallace described only in the vaguest terms in her memoir, and historians have worked carefully around what those vague references might have contained. What is clear is that the marriage became a source of profound unhappiness, and that Wallace endured it far longer than most people realize, nearly a decade. Spencer's naval postings moved them constantly: Pensacola, San Diego, Washington, D.C. For a period in the early 1920s, Spencer was assigned to the U.S. Naval Station in Hong Kong, and Wallace eventually followed him there, though by then the marriage was already fracturing. In Hong Kong, and later in Shanghai, Wallace moved in expatriate social circles, attended parties, and navigated a world that was glamorous on the surface and complicated underneath. It was during this time in China, roughly between 1924 and 1925, that Wallace's life enters territory that has been the subject of enormous speculation. There are rumours, persistent ones, passed through letters and gossip, and eventually documented in British intelligence files, about relationships and experiences she had in China. Some of these have been used over the decades to paint her in a particular light, usually by people who wished to discredit her. The truth of what happened in China is something historians still debate carefully, and the record is murky enough that definitive claims cannot responsibly be made. What can be said is that she returned from China, changed, more confident, more autonomous, less willing to define her entire existence around a man who made her miserable. By the mid-1920s, she and Spencer were effectively living separately. A formal separation came around 1925, and their divorce was finalized in December 1927. In those years between separation and divorce, Wallace spent time in Washington, D.C., staying with friends, rebuilding herself quietly, learning how to be a woman alone without performing distress about it. She was barely 30 years old, once divorced, without significant family money, and navigating a social world where a divorced woman still carried a certain stain, particularly in traditional circles. Most people in her position would have been cautious, conservative, tried to blend back in. Wallace was not most people, and soon enough, she would meet someone who would change everything. Her second marriage seemed, on the surface, like the stable chapter she had been waiting for, but it would turn out to be merely the stage on which the real drama unfolded. Ernest Simpson and the life she almost had. Ernest Aldrich Simpson was, in almost every way, the opposite of Win Spencer. Where Spencer was volatile, Ernest was steady. Where Spencer drank himself into ugliness, Ernest was measured, cultured, and reliable. He was an Anglo-American shipping businessman, born in New York to a British father, educated partly in England, and very much at home in the world of suits, clubs, and quiet intellectual conversation. Wallace met him in Washington, D.C., sometime around 1926, while he was still married to his first wife. That marriage ended, and in July 1928, Wallace and Ernest married in a small civil ceremony in London, where Ernest's business was headquartered. She was 31. He was 30. They set up life in London, in a flat in Bryanston Court in Marylebone, and Wallace threw herself into building exactly the kind of social world she had always been capable of constructing. She became known for her dinner parties, small, carefully curated gatherings where the food was excellent, the conversation was sharp, and the guest list was assembled with precision. She read up on whatever topic was likely to come up in conversation that week. She paid attention to the details that hosts usually overlooked: the wine temperature, the table arrangement, the balance between personalities in the room. It was through this social world that the defining encounter of her life would come, though she could not have known it at the time. In January 1931, Wallace was introduced to Edward, Prince of Wales, at a country house party in Leicestershire, hosted by her friend Thelma Furness. Edward, known to his family and close friends as David, was at that point one of the most famous men on earth. Heir to the British throne, dashingly handsome in photographs, wildly popular with the public, and perpetually at the centre of society's most glittering gatherings. By every account, the first meeting was unremarkable, polite, brief, forgettable. There was no thunderclap, no immediate magnetism. Wallace was simply one guest among many. But the encounters continued over the following year or two at various social events, always in the same interconnected London world. And at some point, gradually, and then all at once, something changed. Edward began singling Wallace out, seeking her company specifically, writing her letters. The nature of his interest became unmistakable. Thelma Furness, who had been the prince's companion before Wallace, later wrote about a conversation in which she asked Wallace to keep an eye on Edward while she travelled to America in early 1934. She meant it as a gesture of trust between friends. By the time Thelma returned, she found that her place in Edward's affections had been thoroughly taken. This is typically where the story gets told as a seduction. Wallace, as the calculating American who moved strategically to claim a prince. But the letters Edward wrote her, hundreds of them, tell a more complicated story. His attachment to her was urgent, almost frantic in its intensity. He wrote to her in terms that were almost startlingly unguarded for a man of his position, referring to her as his entire world, his reason for everything, the only person who made him feel real. He sent her gifts constantly. He telephoned her multiple times a day. He rearranged his schedule to be near her. People in Edward's circle noticed the change in him, the way his attention, previously scattered across social events and obligations, seemed to have collapsed to a single point. Courtiers who had known him for years noted that he appeared more alive in her presence than they had ever seen him, and more desolate in her absence. For Wallace, this level of attention from the heir to the British throne was not easy to process neutrally. She was a woman who had spent most of her adult life being underestimated, financially precarious, socially dependent on the goodwill of others. Suddenly, the most famous man in the English-speaking world was making it clear that she was the center of his universe. Whatever she felt personally, and the record is genuinely ambiguous, the situation had a gravitational force of its own. She was, by her own later admission, genuinely unsettled by the depth of his feeling. She had not gone looking for a king, but the king had come looking for her, with a force she found difficult to redirect. And when the full weight of what Edward was prepared to do became clear, what he was willing to give up, and what it would cost her, the story entered territory that no one in it was truly prepared for. The prince, the palace, and the rising storm. By 1934 and 1935, the relationship between Edward and Wallace had become an open secret in certain circles, the kind of secret that London society knew perfectly well, but did not yet speak about in print. The British press, bound by a kind of informal deference to the royal family, held its silence. American and European newspapers were less restrained, but those reports rarely crossed back into the average British household. Edward was extravagant in his affections. He showered Wallace with jewels, extraordinary pieces, many of them commissioned from Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels, inscribed with private messages and dates significant only to the two of them. He took her on private holidays. He brought her into settings where her presence as his companion was unmistakable to anyone with eyes. Ernest Simpson, watching all of this from relatively close range, handled it with a dignity that history has perhaps not given him enough credit for. He knew what was happening. He was not a foolish man. But he also understood that whatever was unfolding between his wife and the Prince of Wales was operating at a scale he could not reasonably compete with. Not financially, not socially, not in terms of sheer gravitational pull. When King George V died on January 20th, 1936, Edward became King Edward VIII of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British Dominions, and Emperor of India. He was 41 years old, and Wallace Simpson, still technically married to Ernest, divorce proceedings having been initiated but not yet concluded, was suddenly the intimate companion of the King of England. The situation was, from the perspective of the British establishment, completely untenable. The Church of England, of which the King was the supreme governor, did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons whose former spouses were still living. Wallace had one living ex-husband. She was in the process of divorcing a second. For the king to marry her would require either a constitutional revolution or an abdication. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made the stakes clear to Edward in a series of private meetings through the autumn of 1936. The king could not marry Mrs. Simpson with the support of the government. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, all signalled their opposition. The Archbishop of Canterbury was firmly against it. The only path forward that would allow marriage was Edward giving up the throne. Edward asked about a morganatic marriage, a legal arrangement under which Wallis would be his wife, but not his queen, with no royal title passed on to any children. Baldwin told him the government would not support it. The walls were closing in, and the press silence that had held through most of 1936 finally broke in early December of that year, when a bishop in Bradford made an oblique public reference to the king's personal life during a speech. Within days, what every newspaper editor in Britain had known for months was suddenly in print everywhere, and the public found themselves being handed a crisis that had been building quietly for years. Wallis was in the south of France by this point, having left Britain partly to reduce the pressure, at Edward's urging. She was reading the newspapers from abroad, watching the situation detonate at a distance, and by her own account, becoming increasingly alarmed at the direction things were heading. She wrote to Edward, urging him to drop her, to let her disappear from his life so that he could keep his crown. She meant it. The letters were genuine. Edward would not hear of it. Whether his refusal was love in its truest form, or something more complicated, an attachment that had taken on a life beyond rational choice, is a question that the events of December 1936 would answer in the most dramatic way possible. The abdication, 11 months and a kingdom. On December 10th, 1936, King Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication. He had been King of Great Britain for 326 days. The document was witnessed by his three brothers, the Duke of York, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Duke of Kent. His brother Albert, the Duke of York, would take the throne the following day as King George VI. Albert had not wanted this. He was famously private, deeply uncomfortable with public performance, and now he was being handed the weight of the monarchy because his older brother had decided love outranked duty. Edward's abdication broadcast was delivered on the evening of December 11th, 1936, over BBC radio. He spoke carefully, personally, explaining that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loved. The broadcast was heard by millions. It was one of the most remarkable things any monarch had ever said publicly, and it caused a sensation the world over. In France, Wallis listened to the broadcast from the Villa of Friends in Cannes. She was not with him when he spoke. She would not see him again for several months. In the immediate aftermath of the abdication, she was living in a kind of suspension, aware that her name was being read in newspapers across every continent, blamed by many, romanticized by others, and not yet certain what kind of life was even possible on the other side of all this. The public reaction in Britain was complicated. Some mourned the loss of a popular king and directed their anger squarely at Wallis. Hostile letters arrived by the hundreds. There were reports of threats. The warmth that London society had once extended to her at dinner parties and country house weekends evaporated almost overnight, replaced by a cold front that would never fully lift. In America, the response was more mixed. Some newspapers covered it as a grand romance, others as a constitutional scandal. But across the board, Wallis was the story. She was the explanation. She was the reason. What that meant in practical terms was that wherever she went for the rest of her life, the abdication would precede her. It would be the first thing people thought of when they heard her name, the frame through which everything else she did would be interpreted. She was 39 years old when the abdication happened. She would live for another 50 years inside its shadow. Edward, now stripped of his kingship, was given the title the Duke of Windsor. The title of Duchess of Windsor was, after a great deal of deliberation and pressure from the new royal family, denied to Wallis. Even after she and the Duke married, she would be Mrs. Wallis Simpson, then Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, but not Her Royal Highness. That distinction mattered in ways that were not merely ceremonial. It was a public signal from the palace, one that stung deeply and never fully stopped stinging. Wallis and Edward married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Condé in the Indre-et-Loire region of France. It was a private ceremony. No member of the British royal family attended. The Church of England had made clear it would not sanction the marriage. A Church of England clergyman from Darlington, named Robert Anderson, Jardine performed the ceremony anyway, in defiance of his bishop's instructions, an act that effectively ended his institutional career. The wedding photographs show Wallis in a main-bosher gown of a pale blue she called Wallis blue. Her expression is composed. Edward's is almost beatific with relief. He had everything he had said he couldn't live without. And in a matter of months, it would become clear that what he had traded for, it was more than either of them had fully reckoned with. The exile that followed was not the romantic adventure the Duke had imagined. It was a long, strange, uncomfortable road, and Wallis would walk most of it without the warmth of the country she had, in a way, been asked to serve simply by disappearing. Exile, idleness, and the Nazi visit that haunted them forever. The Duke of Windsor had not made plans beyond the marriage. He was, in many ways, constitutionally unsuited for private life. He had been raised to be at the centre of things, to open buildings, attend ceremonies, meet leaders, be useful in the grandest possible sense. Stripped of all that, he drifted. The couple spent the first years of their marriage moving through Europe, France, Austria, various houses lent by wealthy friends, living well, but without purpose. Edward had a private income from the arrangement with the royal family and from the Duchy of Cornwall revenues he had accumulated before the abdication. They were not poor, but they were unmoored. The episode that would prove most damaging to their reputation came in October 1937, just months after the wedding, when the Duke and Duchess of Windsor accepted an invitation to tour Germany as guests of the Nazi government. They met with senior Nazi officials, toured industrial facilities and labor programs, and on October 22, 1937, they visited Adolf Hitler at his retreat at Berchtesgaden. The photographs from that meeting were circulated immediately and widely, the Duke and Hitler shaking hands, the Duke reportedly performing a partial Nazi salute at various points during the visit. The Duke's defenders have argued over the decades that he believed, naively, that a personal diplomatic channel with Germany might help avoid war. His critics have pointed to evidence that his sympathies with certain aspects of the Nazi regime went beyond diplomatic calculation. Declassified British intelligence documents from the wartime period suggest that German officials believed the Duke might be sympathetic to a negotiated peace on terms favourable to Germany. And there were apparently even discussions, though how seriously they were taken remains debated, about a role for the Duke in a post-invasion British government. Wallis's role in all of this has been debated too. Some historians have suggested she was more politically active in encouraging the German connection than the public record shows. Others have argued that she was essentially following her husband's lead, as she did in most political matters, and that attributing independent political agency to her in this context is more about discrediting her than about evidence. What is not debated is that the visit was a catastrophic error in judgment, one that would shadow the Windsors for the rest of their lives, and that the British royal family and government never forgot. When war broke out in September 1939, the Duke was eventually given a posting as governor of the Bahamas, a position that was, by the standards of British imperial appointments, fairly minor, and which many have read as a deliberate effort to park him somewhere far from Europe and far from any potential mischief. The Windsors arrived in Nassau in August 1940 and remained there until 1945. Wallis made the best of it. She organised charitable work, particularly around wartime relief efforts. She decorated Government House. She received guests, hosted dinners, maintained the performance of official life. But Nassau was not London, was not Paris, was not the world she had been part of before all of this. And the isolation was real, even when surrounded by people. The most dramatic and disturbing event of the Nassau years came in July 1943, when Sir Harry Oakes, one of the wealthiest men in the Bahamas and a man the Windsors knew socially, was found murdered in his bed at his estate. The case was sensational, gruesome in its details, and never officially solved. The Duke handled the investigation badly, calling in Miami police rather than Scotland Yard, and the subsequent trial, in which Oakes's son-in-law Alfred de Marigny was acquitted, left a murky, unsatisfying record. The whole affair added another layer of strangeness to the Windsors' Bahamian chapter. But after the war ended, the question facing the Windsors was not what had happened in Nassau. It was what came next, and what a life looked like when it had been stripped of everything that once made it significant. Paris, parties, and the permanent guests of elsewhere. After the war, the Windsors settled principally in France. They took a long lease on a house called the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne, on the outskirts of Paris, courtesy of the French government, and they also kept a country house called the Moulin de la Tuilerie in the Chevreuse Valley. These became the fixed coordinates of a life that was, for all its luxury, essentially rootless. Paris in the post-war years was rebuilding itself as a cultural and social capital, and the Windsors fit neatly into the very top tier of its international social scene. They threw parties. They attended parties. They travelled to New York, to the Mediterranean, to wherever the wealthy migratory class landed in a given season. Wallis became a figure of enormous fashion interest, repeatedly named to best-dressed lists, photographed by every major magazine, studied by designers. She worked at it consciously and seriously. Her style was precise, controlled, and disciplined. She was slim to the point of severity throughout her adult life. She dressed immaculately. She was received everywhere as a social star. But underneath the glittering surface, the problems accumulated quietly. Edward's relationship with purposelessness grew more pronounced over the years. He had occasional moments of hoping for some official role, a return to British public life in some capacity, a posting, anything that gave the days shape and meaning. Those hopes were consistently, quietly extinguished by the palace and by successive British governments. He was given no role. He was not invited to official functions. When he and Wallis visited Britain, they were received privately by the royal family, but never warmly, and never publicly in any way that suggested full rehabilitation. The question of Wallis's HRH title, the one denied to her at the time of the marriage, continued to fester for decades. Edward asked about it repeatedly over the years. The answer was always no. It was a wound that he felt on her behalf even more intensely than she sometimes let on, and it coloured his relationship with his family with a bitterness that never entirely dissolved. There were rumours, persistent and not always sourced, about strains in the marriage itself. The Duke's adoration of Wallis never seemed to waver publicly, but what happened behind closed doors was, as with most marriages, visible only in glimpses. Some of those who knew them well described Wallis as sometimes carrying the weight of being someone's entire world, year after year, with a quiet exhaustion. She had not set out to be a king's singular reason for living. She had simply been there when he decided she was. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the social routine continued. Seasons in France, seasons in New York, winters in Palm Beach, summers on the Mediterranean. Photographs from those years show a couple always well-dressed, always in pleasant company, always performing the ease of the very privileged. The performance required constant effort, and both of them knew it. Their circle included designers, industrialists, American socialites, European aristocrats, and the kind of people who collected interesting company the way others collect art. Cole Porter was a friend. Jimmy Donahue, the flamboyant heir to the Woolworth fortune, was a constant presence in their lives in the early 1950s. And the closeness between him and Wallace was a subject of extensive gossip at the time, though what exactly that friendship comprised remains, as so much in Wallace's life, a matter of careful reading between lines. What is clear is that by the mid-1960s, the social world they had occupied was thinning. Deaths, illnesses, and the general drift of fashionable society away from the traditions they represented meant that the parties became smaller, the circle narrower. Edward's health began to fail, and with it, the practical scaffolding of their shared life began to tremble. The aging process that comes for everyone eventually arrived for the Windsors too, and the final years were among the most quietly devastating of Wallace's long life. The last years, grief, decline, and a gilded loneliness. The Duke of Windsor was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1971, a disease that progressed with cruel speed. He had been a smoker for most of his adult life. By the time of Queen Elizabeth II's state visit to France in May 1972, Edward was gravely ill. The Queen visited him at the Villa Windsor just days before his death. A meeting that was private, brief, and after which photographs showed a man who was barely recognizable as the figure the world had known. Edward, Duke of Windsor, died on May 28, 1972, at the age of 77. He was at home, in the Paris house, with Wallace beside him. His body was flown to England and lay in state at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Wallace came with him, her first return to Britain in many years. The photographs from that visit show her small, dressed in black, moving through corridors of a place that had once held her future and then taken it away. She was 75 years old, and she was visibly struggling. Those who saw her during those days later described her as appearing not merely grieved, but somehow diminished, as though the thing that had organized her life for 35 years had been removed, and she was only now understanding what it had been holding up. She returned to Paris after the funeral, and then the long final chapter began. It was not peaceful. Wallace began to decline both physically and, after a time, mentally. She had a series of health crises, falls, hospitalizations, the gradual erosion of the sharp mind that had once been her defining feature. Her health was managed primarily by a French lawyer and confidant named Maître Suzanne Blum, who had taken on a dominant role in Wallace's affairs and who controlled access to her with an iron thoroughness that concerned many who had known Wallace personally. By the late 1970s, Wallace was largely confined to the Villa Windsor, rarely seen in public, her social life reduced to nothing. Friends who tried to visit were often turned away. Her American relatives reported difficulty making contact. The woman who had once commanded every room she entered was now a prisoner of her own declining years, managed and protected. Or, depending on who you asked, managed and isolated. By a woman whose loyalty to Wallace was absolute, but whose methods raised uncomfortable questions. For nearly a decade before her death, Wallace was in a condition that those close to her described as one of profound withdrawal from the world. She had a feeding tube in her final years. She was, by multiple accounts, no longer able to recognize visitors or process conversation in the way she once had. The villa, grand, beautiful, full of the objects that had marked out the decades of her life with Edward, became a kind of museum around her, with Wallis herself barely present within it. She died on April 24th, 1986, at the Villa Windsor in Paris. She was 89 years old. Her body was flown to England and buried beside the Duke of Windsor at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, within the home park at Windsor Castle. They were together at last in the place they had never quite been allowed to be together during life, on British soil, on royal ground, their names side by side on a stone that gave no hint of the decades of complication that had brought them there. She left behind an estate valued at millions, much of which was eventually bequeathed to the Institut Pasteur in Paris following the death of Maître Blum. Her jewellery collection, those extraordinary pieces commissioned and inscribed by Edward over decades of devotion, was auctioned by Sotheby's in Geneva in 1987 in a sale that attracted buyers from around the world. Each piece carried its private inscription, its date, its intimate shorthand. Going under the hammer, one after another, to strangers. What history did with her? Wallis Simpson has been, depending on the decade and the teller, a villain, a victim, a symbol, and a cautionary tale. The popular image of her as a cold, calculating social climber who manipulated a weak-willed king into abandoning his post has been part of the cultural furniture for so long that it can be hard to see past it. But the record, read carefully and completely, is more textured than that. She was a woman who grew up without financial security, who survived a deeply damaging first marriage, who built herself a life through intelligence and effort, who ended up in the path of a man whose love for her became a force of nature she could not redirect, and who paid the price for being there. She did not ask for the abdication. She attempted, in writing, to prevent it. Whether she could have done more, whether she wanted to, at some level, or whether she genuinely tried and failed, is a question that probably has no clean answer. What she was left with was a man who loved her completely and a world that punished her for it. She spent decades as the woman the British establishment wished would simply not exist. She was denied a title that other royal spouses held as a matter of course. She was kept at the margins of official life. She attended funerals in a country that was, by circumstance, partly hers, and was received not as family, but as an unfortunate guest. And yet she continued. She dressed beautifully. She hosted brilliantly. She kept going in the way that people do when the alternative is too bleak to consider. Whether that constitutes resilience or performance or both, it is hard not to find something remarkable in it. The girl from Baltimore, the one with the absent father and the borrowed money and the schoolgirl's hunger for a world bigger than the one she'd been handed, ended up at the absolute center of one of the 20th century's most spectacular stories. She did not emerge from it unscathed, but she emerged from it as herself, which is more than many people manage. The crown she was blamed for taking was never something she asked for. And the life that replaced it, for all its outward glitter, was one marked by exclusion and grief, and a loneliness that no jewellery collection could quite fill. That, in the end, is the real story of Wallis Simpson. Not the tabloid version, not the romance novel version. Just a woman, navigating a world that had very specific ideas about what she was allowed to be, and refusing, quietly, to be only that. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.